Welcome to Justice Reloaded HD. Have you ever seen someone take a step, awkward, trembling, maybe even a little out of place, but somehow that single step made the whole room pause? Today's story starts with a boy whose feet don't move like everyone else's, and a waitress who decided to follow his lead, even when the music didn't. What happened next changed more than just a dance floor. If you believe leadership isn't about strong feet, but about someone believing in you enough to follow, then hit that like button and subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD. Stay with us till the end, because today's dance doesn't need perfect rhythm. It just needs the right heart. It was a Friday evening, and the warm hum of a live jazz trio floated through the air of the Bellamy Room, a quiet, upscale restaurant nestled in a corner of the city that seemed to hum a little slower than the world outside. On weekends, the soft music turned the dining space into a kind of shared reverie, where diners occasionally rose from their tables to sway gently in each other's arms. Not quite a dance floor, not quite a stage, just a polished stretch of hardwood between tables, meant for small movements and even smaller courage. At table 5, a boy sat in silence, watching the sway of those brave enough to step out. His name was Jamie Voss, 8 years old, shoulders slightly hunched, feet still and uncertain beneath the tablecloth. His legs didn't always listen to him. Diagnosed with dystonia as a toddler, Jamie's muscles would twist without warning, his balance unreliable, his steps slow and often punctuated by small collapses. Once, during a family outing to a children's museum, he'd tripped in the middle of a crowded room and fallen hard. Laughter had followed, not cruel exactly, just reflexive, sharp, unthinking. But it had sunk its way deep into him. Since then, Jamie hadn't stood in public without first glancing at the eyes around him. Across the table sat his father, Harlan Voss, real estate tycoon, widower, and a man who had mastered the art of presence without emotion. Harlan loved his son, though few would guess it by how he stood guard over him, as if love meant shielding, silencing, holding everything still. They didn't go out often. Harlan only agreed to this restaurant because the maitre d' was discreet, and the booths were tucked in corners. Jamie barely noticed the food. What held his gaze wasn't on the plate but just beyond it, a waitress, her brown hair pulled back in a soft bun, moving gracefully between tables with a silver tray in hand and a quiet, practiced smile. She walked like music, balanced and understated. Her name tag read Clara. Clara Shaw had once danced under stage lights, her name printed on programs in bold letters for a downtown modern dance company. That was before the accident. A torn ligament during rehearsal had ended her career on stage. Since then she'd learned to live off rhythm, waiting tables, keeping her body still even as something inside her still pulsed to a beat no one else could hear. As she approached table 5 with a refill of lemonade, Jamie's eyes dropped to her shoes, soft-soled worn, with a kind of flex in the leather that only dancers notice. He didn't look up as he asked, his voice barely more than a breath. "Do you still dance?" Clara blinked. She hadn't been asked that in years. She crouched beside the table so she could answer on his level, not towering over the question. "Only when someone dares to lead," she whispered, a smile tugging gently at the corner of her lips. Jamie's small hands gripped the edge of the seat, his knuckles pale. He didn't think. He just moved. Slowly, uncertainly, with a tremble that began in his knees and traveled up his spine, Jamie stood. It wasn't graceful. His body wobbled like a branch in early wind. But he didn't fall. He turned to Clara and lifted one arm. His fingers stretched out in invitation, not command, not request. Just a boy, offering a lead he wasn't sure he could take. Clara looked at the tiny hand before her. Around them, the music swelled just slightly. A soft waltz, 1 2 3, 1 2 3. She glanced at the other tables, the couples, the eyes half turned in curiosity. Then she set down her tray, wiped her hands on the hem of her apron, and placed her palm in his. He took a step. Clara didn't hesitate. Not outwardly, at least. Her hand slid gently into Jamie's, and for a moment, it felt like the entire room had exhaled. The clink of silverware dulled, the murmur of conversation softened to a hush. No one announced a dance. No spotlight swiveled. But still, eyes began to turn. Jamie stood stiff, his back straight not from posture but from sheer determination. His grip was light, almost unsure, and his feet shuffled in hesitation. Clara waited. She didn't guide him. Didn't offer a signal or a cue. She simply stood with him, letting his pulse lead. One step. It came from Jamie's left foot, the toe dragging slightly as he moved forward. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't even steady. His knees bent at strange angles, his torso overcorrecting in small jerks, as though every part of him was renegotiating what it meant to move. But still, he led. Clara stepped with him. She let herself fall into his rhythm, however uneven it was. She didn't adjust his pace, didn't mask his offbeat. Her body, once trained to follow music with perfect precision, now followed a boy with unsure feet. And in that quiet compliance, something in the room shifted. One couple near the center paused their dancing. The man lowered his hand from his partner's waist, watching curiously over her shoulder. Another guest, lifting a glass of wine, slowed mid-sip. The pianist, fingers still drifting over the keys, allowed the tempo to fade until the melody became ambient, like memory rather than music. Jamie took another step, then stumbled. His foot scraped awkwardly to the side, and for a second he froze, shoulders rising toward his ears in embarrassment. A quiet laugh broke from somewhere to the left, soft, restrained, but unmistakable. Clara didn't flinch. Instead, she gave Jamie the faintest smile, nothing wide, nothing pitying. Just enough to say, "I'm still here." She shifted her weight with his, absorbing the stagger without correcting it. Her movements were subtle but intentional, letting Jamie believe, rightly, that he was in control. That he was the one guiding them through this strange waltz of uncertain steps. More people noticed now. A waiter paused mid-pour. An older couple near the bar turned their heads. The laughter didn't grow louder, but it lingered, awkward and unsure, floating just at the edge of the scene. Still, Clara didn't turn around. She had placed the entire room behind her, both literally and emotionally, choosing instead to mirror Jamie's faltering courage. To him, each step was monumental. And to her, each one was sacred. A few children watched, wide-eyed, from another table. One whispered something to her mother, pointing, not at the oddness of the boy's gait, but at the way the woman held his hand like it was something breakable and precious. Jamie, still tense, managed 3 steps before looking up at Clara for the first time since he began. "Is it okay?" he asked quietly, breath hitching. Clara nodded, just once. "It's perfect." She didn't lie to protect him. She said it because it was true. There was something raw, almost holy, in the way he moved, not despite the difficulty, but because of it. Every lurch, every off-balance pivot was a declaration: "I'm still here. I'm still trying. I'm still moving." And that, to Clara, was dance at its most honest. They made it 5 steps. Maybe 6. It didn't matter. They weren't measured in distance or form. The steps existed for their own sake, each one a small revolution. Behind them, the laughter had faded. The pianist played softer now, almost tentatively, as if unsure whether the music should accompany or observe. Guests leaned back into their seats, not dismissing the moment, but absorbing it, unsure how to behave in its presence. Clara and Jamie kept moving. Harlan Voss stepped back into the dining room with his phone still in hand, the screen gone dark. He had only been gone a few minutes, just enough time to answer a call from a junior partner about a zoning delay on a downtown property. He hadn't expected anything to change while he was away. He certainly hadn't expected the sight that now froze him at the entrance. His son was standing. Not just standing, moving. Jamie, his 8-year-old boy whose feet had betrayed him more often than not, was out in the open, in front of people, on the restaurant floor. And beside him, impossibly steady and calm, was the waitress. Her hand rested lightly in Jamie's, her eyes fixed only on him. She wasn't correcting him. She wasn't guiding. She was letting him lead. Harlan's breath caught. His instinct was immediate, protective: intervene. Step in. Pull Jamie back to the booth. Shield him from what came next: laughter, stares, failure. His foot twitched forward. But he didn't move. His legs betrayed him now, not from weakness, but from something heavier: uncertainty. For the first time in years, Harlan Voss, man of plans, projections, and precise decisions, didn't know what to do. He couldn't process what he was seeing. Jamie took a step, slow and wobbly. The restaurant had grown eerily quiet, as if every patron had turned their ears toward the sound of that single shoe brushing the floor. The pianist's hands had stopped mid-measure, frozen over the keys. The room wasn't watching out of mockery, Harlan realized. It was holding its breath. And so was he. He looked at Clara. She didn't glance at him. Didn't check for approval. She stayed with Jamie, matching his hesitant rhythm, mirroring the subtle shake in his limbs. Her expression was calm, focused, like someone tuning herself to a quiet song only she could hear. Jamie hesitated, his right foot hovering, unsure. He looked up at Clara, his eyes flickering, searching for something. That's when she whispered. "Keep going," she said. "I'm still here." The words weren't loud. They weren't even meant for Harlan. But he heard them anyway. And something about them cracked open a space in him that had long since hardened over. Jamie's foot landed. It didn't tremble. It didn't jerk. For the first time Harlan could remember, Jamie moved his right foot without hesitation. It was a tiny step, nearly invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. But Harlan was. And it stopped his heart. He felt the back of his throat tighten. The urge to protect, to interfere, melted into something else, something messier. Pride? Fear? Guilt? He didn't know. He only knew that for the first time, his son wasn't following. He was leading. And Harlan was the one standing still. No one clapped. No one gasped. There was no cue for that. The room remained in reverent silence, caught in the stillness between notes. In that stillness, Harlan finally lowered his phone to his side, the screen's faint glow now irrelevant. Clara didn't look at him, and Jamie didn't know he was watching. But Harlan watched every movement, every sway, every adjustment, every time Clara allowed herself to be pulled slightly off-center just to follow Jamie's uneven beat. It wasn't choreography. It wasn't a performance. It was trust. And in that moment, something clicked deep within the father's chest, like a key turning slowly in a lock he didn't know was there. He stayed at the edge of the room, hands loose at his sides, unable to step forward, unwilling to step away. The ride home was quiet. The kind of quiet that wasn't born of awkwardness, but of something still unfolding, like the moments after a bell rings, when the air still hums with its echo. Harlan kept his eyes on the road, his hand steady on the steering wheel. Jamie sat in the passenger seat, his legs swinging just above the floorboard, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the window. The city lights moved past in long blurred streaks, but neither of them commented on the night. Not the restaurant. Not the dance. Not the way everyone had stopped to watch. Especially not the way Jamie had moved, on his own. By the time they pulled into the driveway, the house was already cloaked in soft darkness. Porch lights cast long shadows on the stone walkway, and the living room's faint amber glow leaked out through the window blinds. Harlan turned off the engine but didn't move to unbuckle his seatbelt. Jamie didn't either. It was the boy who broke the silence. "I don't think I need you to hold my hand so much anymore," he said softly, not looking at his father. Harlan turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" Jamie hesitated, his fingers tracing the seam of the car seat. "I mean, I can still fall. I know that. But I think I can lead, too. If someone lets me." The words weren't defiant. They weren't even bold. They were quiet, careful, like a fragile offering laid at someone's feet. Harlan opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had heard many things in his life, negotiations, arguments, confessions, but this wasn't just a statement. It was a shift. A declaration not of independence, but of identity. Jamie wasn't asking permission. And that, more than anything, caught Harlan off guard. "I've always held your hand because I wanted to keep you safe," he said finally, his voice low. "I know," Jamie replied. "But sometimes, when you hold too tight, it makes it harder to move." The truth of that landed heavily between them, not harsh, but honest. Harlan stared straight ahead. He could remember every fall Jamie had ever taken. Every scraped knee, every failed step. Every time his son had looked up at him from the floor, blinking back frustration, asking silently for help. And Harlan had always responded the same way, by reaching down, lifting him, deciding what came next. It had never occurred to him that Jamie might want to try without him. Until tonight. Until that waitress, Clara, had placed her trust, not in Harlan's protection, but in Jamie's lead. And Jamie had risen to it. The boy finally unbuckled his seatbelt, the faint click pulling Harlan from his thoughts. Jamie opened the car door, but didn't step out yet. Instead, he turned to his father one last time. "I'm not saying I don't need you," he said. I don't always want to be the one being led." Harlan looked at him, really looked, at the boy's round face, his thinning frame, the earnestness in his voice. For a moment, he saw not the fragility, not the diagnosis, not the fear. He saw a boy trying to claim space in a world that often told him to wait. And he had no response. Not because he disagreed, but because the words Jamie had spoken weren't up for debate. They weren't seeking approval. They were simply the truth, laid bare. Harlan gave a small nod. Nothing grand. Just enough for Jamie to notice. The boy smiled, faintly, then slid out of the car and closed the door behind him. Harlan sat alone in the driver's seat for another long moment, listening to the silence stretch around him. Tonight, his son had taken the lead. And he was still trying to catch up. The next morning, Harlan returned to the Bellamy room. It wasn't during regular hours. The place was quiet, no clinking glasses, no murmured conversations, no low piano melodies weaving between tables. Just sunlight pouring in through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the floor where, less than a day ago, his son had taken the lead. He hadn't made an appointment. He didn't know if she'd even be there. But Clara was. She stood near the bar, polishing a row of clean glasses with a white towel, her movements smooth and methodical. She looked up as the door opened, her face neutral at first, until recognition softened her features. "Mr. Voss," she said, her voice measured. Not cold, not familiar. Just even. Harlan approached slowly. He was in his usual pressed suit, the lines crisp, his shoes polished to perfection. But something in his posture seemed off, not weakened, but searching. He didn't offer pleasantries. Didn't ask how she was. He got straight to the point. "You weren't afraid?" he asked. When he stood up in front of all those people? Clara paused, setting the glass down carefully. "Afraid of what?" "That he'd fall," Harlan said. "That he'd be laughed at. That it would all go wrong." Clara tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You mean, was I afraid of failure?" Harlan didn't answer. The question felt heavier than it should have. "No," Clara said at last. "I wasn't afraid he'd fall." She folded the towel slowly, placing it on the bar. Her eyes met his, calm but steady. "I was afraid no one would follow him," she continued. "That he'd stand there offering to lead, and no one would be willing to be led." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was sobering. Clara leaned her elbows on the bar, her voice softer now. "People like Jamie, they're used to being guided, told, pulled, corrected. Every step they take comes with someone ready to step in. It's well-meaning. But sometimes, it teaches them they can't move unless someone else decides how. She paused, then added, "Your son didn't just move. He invited someone else to move with him." Harlan swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. He had spent years anticipating every risk, preparing every safety net. Every school, every outing, every social event had been filtered through a lens of control, what could go wrong, and how he could prevent it. He had framed it as protection. But now, listening to Clara, he heard something else: restriction. He could have gotten hurt, he said, but even as he said it, the words sounded thinner than usual. Clara didn't flinch. He could have, she agreed. But he didn't. And even if he had, at least it would have been his fall. His choice. Not a cage you wrapped around him just in case. Her tone wasn't harsh. It was factual. Honest. And it left no room for defense. Harlan didn't respond. He stood there, unmoving, staring at a spot on the bar like it might answer for him. Finally, Clara added, "You looked like you wanted to stop him last night." "I did," he admitted quietly. "Why didn't you?" Harlan's lips pressed into a thin line. "Because he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at you." That earned a small, almost imperceptible nod from Clara. "He was leading," she said. "And I said yes." The room remained still. Just the creak of the wood as Harlan finally pulled out a stool and sat down. He didn't argue. He didn't counter. He didn't try to reframe the moment into something rational. He just sat. And for the first time in a very long time, Harlan Voss listened, without trying to take back control. The community dance studio didn't look like much from the outside, just a converted firehouse with chipped paint, old brick, and a wooden sign that read Open Hands Movement Center. But inside, the air was full of motion, gentle, imperfect, human motion. Children with braces on their legs moved in wide arcs. Some were guided by therapists, others by their parents, and still others, astonishingly, by each other. Harlan stood in the doorway, out of place in his tailored suit. He watched as Clara knelt beside a boy with a walker, showing him how to shift his weight gently from heel to toe. Her voice was soft, encouraging, but not pitiful. It was instruction, not consolation. When the boy stumbled, she didn't rush to catch him. She let him wobble, regain balance, and finish the movement on his own. Harlan waited until the boy returned to his seat, then stepped forward. Clara saw him coming and didn't look surprised. "I figured I'd see you here," she said, wiping her hands on a towel. Harlan nodded. "I didn't come to thank you," he said plainly. "I didn't expect you to." There was a pause. He looked past her, toward the floor, watching the scuff marks left behind by tentative feet, hopeful feet. Then he looked back at her. "I don't need someone to teach my son how to dance," he said quietly. "He's already doing that." Clara raised an eyebrow, waiting. Harlan took a breath. "I need someone to teach me how not to hold him back, how to stop dragging him along." The admission tasted unfamiliar. It sat on his tongue like something he'd never allowed himself to say, not at board meetings, not at therapy sessions, not even in the quiet of his own thoughts. He'd spent years being the guide, the guardian, the barrier between his son and pain. He had never considered that Jamie might need him to step aside instead. Clara said nothing for a moment. Then she nodded once, firm, not patronizing. She extended her hand. "Then start by stepping where he steps," she said. "Not where you think he should go." Harlan looked at her hand, then slowly reached out and took it. Her grip was steady, not firm, not soft, just present. She walked him to the edge of the room, where the music had started up again, slow, instrumental, no rhythm too rigid. A boy with a prosthetic leg was guiding his mother in a sidestep pattern, their arms loosely joined. Another child twirled in uncoordinated circles, laughing. "You see them all dancing," Clara said, her voice low. "But they're not following the beat. They're following each other." Harlan watched. "I thought I had to keep Jamie upright," he murmured. I thought that was the point of being a father. Clara turned to him. Maybe being a father isn't about holding them up. Maybe it's about not pulling them off balance when they've found their own. He exhaled, long and slow. Where do I start? He asked. Clara pointed gently toward the center of the room. You start there. One step behind him. Then softer, don't pull. Just follow. The Spring Festival was held in a modest auditorium at the edge of town, a space usually reserved for PTA meetings and local recitals. But today, it had been transformed with paper lanterns, hand-painted banners, and rows of folding chairs filled with families, teachers, and neighbors who had come to celebrate the kids often left out of the spotlight. Backstage, the air was filled with nervous whispers and the rustle of costumes not meant for perfection, but for presence. Jamie stood off to the side, wearing a simple white shirt and black pants, his hair combed down carefully by his father just an hour before. No sequins. No routine. Just him. He was the last scheduled to perform. Not because he had prepared some grand finale, but because Clara had quietly asked the organizers if he could go last, not to end the show, but to open something new. The announcer, a kindly woman with a clipboard and a beaming smile, stepped up to the microphone. Our next performer, she said, doesn't have a song. He doesn't have a partner. He just has a direction. And sometimes, that's enough. She stepped back. And Jamie walked out. There was no music. No one clapped at first. They weren't sure if they were supposed to. Jamie stood center stage, eyes fixed somewhere in the middle distance, knees slightly bent, arms relaxed at his sides. For a heartbeat, it looked like he might turn around and walk off. But then, he moved. A step forward. His left foot first. A small shift of weight, his arm swinging gently, unconsciously, to balance him. Then another step. Right foot. Solid landing. He wasn't dancing. Not in the traditional sense. There was no choreography, no rhythm. Just movement, deliberate, careful, his own. And slowly, something changed. From the third row, a woman stood up. She was maybe in her 40s. With graying hair pulled into a tight bun. She didn't say anything. She just stepped out into the aisle and took a step forward, mirroring Jamie. A moment later, a man in a wheelchair wheeled himself a few feet from his spot and turned in Jamie's direction. Then another parent. Then a teenage girl. One by one, the adults in the room, parents, volunteers, teachers, began to rise and move. Not toward Jamie, but with him. Each step he took on stage seemed to pull someone to their feet in the audience. Still, Jamie didn't look up. He wasn't watching them. He just kept stepping forward, then sideways, then a slow turn that bent his knee too far but didn't make him stop. Backstage, Clara stood beside Harlan. Her arms were crossed, but her eyes shimmered. Harlan leaned toward her, voice low. What is he doing? He asked. His tone wasn't skeptical, it was reverent. Clara didn't look away from the stage. He's not dancing, she said. He's leading. Harlan looked back at his son, who now stood at the edge of the stage, breath heavy but steady, arms raised slightly, palms open, not to receive applause but to hold space. And below him, almost a third of the room was on its feet, moving. Awkward steps, quiet nods, small gestures that said, "We're with you. We see you." No spotlight followed Jamie. No crescendo rose behind him. And yet, it felt like the whole world had shifted by a degree. Not because a boy danced well, but because he moved, and others followed. In life, we spend so much time guiding others, our children, our students, the people we love, believing that our strength, our direction, our experience is what will keep them safe. And perhaps for a time, it does. But there comes a moment, quiet and often unexpected, when the people we've held on to begin to move in ways we didn't anticipate. They take a step without asking. They reach out without permission. And in that moment, we face a choice that defines not just our love, but our humility. Do we pull them back, or do we follow? This story reminds us that leadership does not always wear the face of confidence or capability. Sometimes, it trembles. Sometimes, it stumbles. But it still moves forward. Jamie led not because he was the strongest, but because he dared to step. Clara followed not because she had to, but because she chose to trust his direction. As we age, the world often tells us our role is to teach, to lead, to stay in control. But perhaps the greatest wisdom comes in knowing when to let go of control, and when to step into the quiet grace of being led. In the end, there is no shame in following those who walk slower, speak softer, or move differently. Sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do is follow the ones we've spent our lives trying to lead. If you've ever dreamed of leading someone, but thought you weren't strong enough, graceful enough, or steady enough, remember this. To follow someone is a gift. But to be followed by choice, by trust, that is a miracle. Like and subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD. And tell us, when was the last time you followed someone who wasn't perfect, but was real?